Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to whosoever is listening, whenever you are listening. I have put together a few thoughts and ideas, mostly inspired because of a video I saw recently by a particular evangelical pastor. Pardon the cat, well, one of them, having fun with cardboard back there. But the purpose of this video is to provide an overview of the translation history of the Bible with the express purpose of proving that God did preserve his words, at least based on what I've seen. It's been proven to me, and I just want to share this information because I'm surprised that pastors and theologians, because there are others, try not to get stuck on rabbit trails, but it's amazing the amount of intelligent people within theological circles that don't get this issue. And speaking of that, my title, two texts. So I definitely need to explain that. If you're going by some basic definition such as this, you might be a little confused. But that's not the definition I'm using. I'm using something more along the lines of this. Did I put the right one up? Hope I did. Oh, there it is. There it is. There. I'm referring to it in a very specific way. There's the text behind the King James Bible, because at the end of the day, that's really all there is on the one side. And then there's the text behind, I should do it the other way, King James Bible, King James Bible, doesn't matter yet. I'm thinking of this slide. I guess I can go ahead and slide it over. I'm thinking of that slide there. But, no, back to this. Okay, yeah, so I'm going to try to go over in this video why there's just two texts, why I'm saying this. It is something I have been taught, but it's something I accept as a truth. You've got King James side of things, and you got the other side, and I might as well move to that, back to the other slide. All right. Forgive me if I'm a little slow. Trying to get my brain up to speed here, but sometimes the body and mind do not cooperate with what the spirit wishes to do, and I have a strong desire to get these things across, but I have to fight off a little bit of mental fogginess for some reason. Okay, so let's go over some of these terms here that I have up on screen. As you can see, I've got received text, Alexandrian text. These names can work, but there are other names that apply, and the top four here would be some of those names that apply broadly to all of these texts that back up the King James Bible. And for that matter, they back up a whole lot of other Bibles in other languages. It's just in English, and there are older ones, and we'll get to those as we go through the history survey. But in modern times, where God has, at least for those of us who study the topic, and it's kind of obvious to us, there's a clear line through history where God's finger has been guiding. We see it. And in a minute here, we'll go over some verses, but I do want to go over the text terminology here. So Antiochum, this just refers to the city of Antioch in Syria, which should be part of Asia Minor. And forgive me, I should have had a map ready for that, but I didn't think about that. If you picture the country of Turkey, also called Asia Minor in your Bibles, you have the side where you have all those islands near Greece. You have the Hellespont up top, and then of course you have the Black Sea above. Mount Ararat, or Noah's Ark land, is actually on this side. And south of that, near Syria, well, modern nation of Syria, there's a little bit of water. It's like a little, what do you call that? A bay that comes in there. Right where Turkey and Syria meet, just north of that is where Antioch, the ancient city of Antioch, used to be. I think it's still a city there. I'm pretty sure it is. But it was bigger. It was a bigger deal back then. Like, it was a major center. And after the great persecution because of the Jews and the war that started to break out there in Jerusalem, this is after Jesus' resurrection, Christian persecution began. It's recorded in the book of Acts. The Christians moved out. Well, the city of Antioch in Turkey, modern day Turkey. Back then it would still been the land of Syria, I believe. That may be incorrect, but it doesn't matter. The point is, it's named after the city, because that's where the Christians were. That's where a lot of scribes, no doubt, were, especially the newly saved Jewish scribes, and they would have started making copies of Scripture. And I guess it's worth noting here, there is this theory that Doctors Westcott and Hort, we'll get to them eventually, put out about a textual recension. They tried to sum all of the received text, majority text, whatever, into one text and try and say, oh, they all make copies from this one. And it's an absurd text, forgive me, absurd idea when you examine it. Unfortunately, I'm, again, just trying to do more of an overview survey of the history of Bible translation here, with the dedicated purpose of showing how God preserved it, at least as much as I can see. And it would be a bit of a rabbit trail that doesn't necessarily help if I went into that textual criticism, again, the text recension theory. So we're not going to dive into that, but I am aware that it exists. Now, majority, that name applies just because there's the most of these texts. I mean, even if you go on Wikipedia, you type in received text, Byzantine text, majority text, you're gonna get a decent list of the well-known manuscripts that have been found. And a manuscript is just, a whole complete document of obviously I don't have any manuscripts here. We have books, because manuscripts exist up until the days of printing. Once they started printing in the 1500s, then you had books. You no longer have manuscripts, which were written out by scribes. So a manuscript is an ancient book, an ancient document, you could say. And anyways, majority text, it's called that because there are so many of them compared to this other side, the Alexandrian side. Again, we'll get to that. Of course, it's just called traditional over here, and ecclesiastical just because it was traditional. This kind of ties in with received. It was received by the churches. It was traditionally used by the churches. Like, we're talking 95, 98% of the time early on, and after a short period where they would have used, and again, we'll get to it with these other texts here, with a short bit of time where they would have maybe looked at and used some of the Alexandrian texts, it was very quickly recognized these had issues, because of the majority of the texts that they had that said otherwise. Ecclesiastical, that just refers to the ecclesia, the church, the leadership. Now these other terms, let's get to these. These other terms here are specific to different languages. And Byzantine, I meant to look up what that language was, forgive me. It may be the Turkish language, but it was common in the Byzantine Empire. That's how it got that name. So, Coptic, that's a language spoken and used down in Africa, south of Egypt. There's a large Christian community there. There was actually a large Jewish community there previously. And when a lot of them got saved, and also Christians migrated south, they grew into a group. Coptic Christians, they're still there to this day. Syriac, the language of Syrian, they're in the nation of Syria. Gothic, that would also be a little later on in Europe. You can imagine, of course, the Gothic tribes. And then Textus Receptus is probably one of the most famous because it's old. This would be Latin. The Latin texts, and there are many of them. Erasmus is famous for using the Textus Receptus. For creating what would be called the Textus Receptus. He's the priest, scribe, who created a Latin text. It would also become known as the Latin Vulgate. Some are critical of it just simply because it's a one-man work. There's a number of typographical and spelling errors, but these things are easily fixed, and they fixed a lot of them in the first few printings because Erasmus finished his Textus Receptus right about the time they started to print Bibles. So it was very useful. The King James translators did use a lot of Textus Receptus text. I'm not too worried about any of the criticisms against the Textus Receptus because it matches very closely with the majority Byzantine Antiochian text is clearly a received text. It's not this other kind. And again, we will get to this other kind. But I need to show you. Oh, come on, buttons. There we go. Let's look at a verse. Let's look at a verse that specifically, and this would be one of the reasons why I believe God preserved, is because of verses like this. Oh, that's this one. All right, Psalm 12, verse 6. That's right, yeah, I do want this verse first. Psalm chapter 12, verse 6 says, "The words of the Lord are pure words, as silver tried in a furnace of earth, purified 7 times. Thou shalt keep them, O Lord. Thou shalt preserve them from this generation forever." Verse 7, which I just read, that's like the most direct line speaking of God's promise. And you can look at the context in Psalm 12. David's bragging on God, specific to, as he often did, against his enemies. Well, what are these people going to do? What are they going to say? Verses 3 and 4. But he's bragging on God, and God, he has this statement. "The words of the Lord are pure words, as silver tried in a furnace of earth, purified 7 times." That last phrase there, purified 7 times, is just fascinating in that with the English language, there's pretty clearly, some argue for 8, but there's pretty clearly 7 clear English versions of the Bible that led up to King James, the King James being the 7th one. So it's just kind of interesting that number is mentioned here. However, within the Bible context, God uses, I'm looking over here because there's a whole study on this. And it's a fascinating study, and it only works with the King James or the received text. You can do it with the other text, the Alexandrian text, but because of the omissions and the changes, it doesn't work out. Within the King James, God has a numbering system. He has both hidden in the text and plainly written in the text. He's got a numbering system that is powerful. Actually, it even matches up with verse and chapter numberings, because I've definitely come across, even in fundamental circles, pastors saying that verses and chapters aren't inspired. And while there's a limited logic to that, you think about it long enough, you realize that's a foolish thing to say. God is sovereign over everything. You really think he's going to allow somebody to go in, number the sections of his Bible, and him not have a say in it? Come on. That's not even logical from a biblical point of view. Of course, God supervised whoever, and I remember seeing the name earlier, but I don't remember what it is. But there was a man, I want to say it was the 1500s? It was the 1700s. Anyways, whenever it was, putting in the chapters, the verses, God certainly guided and directed in that. And if you do a number study of the Bible, it becomes pretty obvious. But that's a rabbit trail. Back on point. So, Psalm 12, verse 6 is where God states that he'll preserve it. All right, now let's look at Matthew 5:18, which I have up here on screen. Matthew 5:18. That's what I have open here. I'll read the verse before, just to give a little more context. Obviously, any of these verses I'm bringing up, if you feel the need to, you can study further in context if you need more. But I'm trusting that most people watching this video are going to be at least somewhat familiar with the Bible. Otherwise, why are you watching a video about Bible translation history, huh? All right, so verse 17 in chapter 5 of Matthew. "Think not that I am come to destroy the law or prophets. I am not come to destroy, but to fulfill." Of course, this is Jesus talking. "For verily I say unto you, till heaven and earth pass away, one jot or one tittle shall in no wise pass from the law, till all be fulfilled." That last phrase always makes me wonder, is it going to change when I get to heaven? I don't know, but that's silly speculation we don't have to worry about right now. So, I have a bit of a paraphrase here on screen. "Not one jot or one tittle shall pass from the law." What is a jot or a tittle? Well, a jot or a tittle is what you have here on screen. And if you open to, I should have kept my Bible, open to Psalm 119, you can see the letters of the Hebrew alphabet. I don't know if every Bible version has this, but the King James definitely does. You can take a look at mine here. You can see the different letters. What I have marked here over top of those verses is where you have these examples. So if you were to look at verse 9 of Psalm 119, verse 9, right over top, you have the letter Beth. And that letter I have on screen here of the top 4, it's one in the bottom left. And then, of course, if you go to verse 73, let's see, there you are. You have a Jod. The Jod is the little one at the bottom here, the picture. Over there. That is an individual letter. It's the smallest letter of the Hebrew alphabet. Now, it's very interesting that Jesus is pointing this one out, because the smallest letter and then a tittle. A tittle is the little marks. I have them marked in red here on the picture now. Well, they'd be there for you. I forget things are opposite. These are tittles, these little marks. And you see, I have it side by side, the letter that it differentiates it from. The only difference is this mark, the tittle. So Jesus is literally saying, not one letter, not even the smallest one, and not one part of a letter will pass. This is a fascinating promise. It's very specific, very specific. And let's consider one more verse within the context of what we're talking about here. Matthew chapter 4, verse 4. But he, Jesus, answered and said, this is him speaking back to Satan during the wilderness temptation, it is written, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceedeth out of the mouth of God. How about that? So stuff like this, verses like this in the Bible, and there are more. I would encourage you to get this book right here. He does a detailed study of each and every verse that relates to this subject at all. Verses like this is what we fundamentalists, because this is a fundamental, the Bible is God's word, and God preserved it for us, what he inspired, the word he inspired, and surely you're familiar with that verse in, I want to say it's 1 Timothy. God inspired, God breathed every single word of the Bible, but then he also preserved it. He promised to preserve it. Way back when he was inspiring David to write the Psalms, he promised to preserve it. What's it say in verse 6 of chapter 12 of Psalms? Thou shalt keep them, thou shalt preserve them from this generation, when David was alive, forever. In Matthew chapter 4, we, man, is supposed to live by every word that proceeded out of the mouth of God. Jesus saying, not one letter, not one piece of a letter shall pass from the law. Is it not obvious here? I'm just amazed. The video I watched the other day by this evangelical pastor, and he does know his Bible, and he's a good man, as so many of these people are. Just apparently he's ignorant of what his Bible says, though he's not a King James Bible user. And I'm wondering, because there are changes in the newer Bibles, did the newer Bibles change these verses in this spot? That's actually something I should have looked up for this study. That would have been good. But I didn't. I've looked up a couple other verses to show you some interesting differences. But not that one. I think it would take me a little too long if I tried to do it now. Because I have this copy. This has King James, but it also has 3 other Bible versions in it. I've got a book of Josephus here. I have the Dewey Rhymes, which is the official Catholic Bible. Anyways, let's move on. Let's finish up the good side of the text here. So, the received text, we've got the names of like the text as a whole, and then some of the specifics with the language. And of course, as I already mentioned, you can find good copies of the Bible that come from this received text line in other languages, in Italian, French, Spanish, German, all of that. But in English, because I'm an English speaker, and of course, King James Bible, and that's what this video is. A lot of it has to do with that. I'm pointing over here, of course, King James Bible. This in blue here, this list is the main Bibles that would come that lead up to the King James Bible. And I do have a chart. Yes, I did. Let's see. I might have it buried too deep. Well, it doesn't really matter. It's just got the years that these things were put out. So it would be, I want to say 1500s when Tyndale first does his. Then there's a Coverdale Bible. Then there's the Matthews Bible. Then there's the Great Bible. My understanding is the Great Bible was done by a team that King Henry VIII hired. So that's, whereas the previous ones were done, and this is during a time when 1500. So the Reformation is starting to kick off, but they're exiting the Dark Ages. The Catholic Church is starting to lose its grasp over the nations of Europe and, in the world at the time. But because the Catholic Church didn't want the common person reading the Bible because that caused too many issues, this just led to a series of events that would culminate in the Reformation. And in England specifically, people like Tyndale, William Tyndale, and Coverdale, they started to say, hey, we need a Bible in our language. And they wanted to take the time and effort. They had a desire, they had a willingness to do so. So that's where these things come about. And as I said, the Great Bible, that's a team hired by King Henry VIII. Pretty sure I got that right. And then the Bishop's Bible would be another group along that line. I don't know if it's a particular king that hired them in that case. But each time they're improving on the last one, trying to do a little better. Well, the seventh time around, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I am missing one. I'm missing Geneva. Geneva's supposed to be in here. Forgive me for that oversight. So the Geneva Bible will be another one. So you got those 6, and then you have it's in 1604 when this group of Puritan, were they called Puritans back then? 1604? Yeah, I guess they would be. But it's a group of several believers. There's Baptists, there's Anglicans, there's various Protestants, but there's Baptists there too. And the point is, it's a group of men who realize, look, we have precedent now, and we know they're talking to King James I. We know that you are for doing this. Were you willing to go ahead and pay for it and make sure that this, you'll have your stamp of approval? They talked to King James I. He loved the idea. He gladly would pay for it. And so the King James team, also called the Westminster team, actually there's several teams, again, all listed out in this book, detailed extremely well. I'll have this and all the sources I'm referencing listed in the notes of this video, of course. But the King James Version would be the most epic team of scholars put together, and that deserves a video series of its own, digging into all of these guys and the amazing work that they did. And I wish I could get into it, but again, that's not necessarily the purpose of this video, because this is an overview and more of a summary. But it would, if you are serious, if you're someone who happens to be listening to this and you don't already believe, or you have doubts, or you want to know, that would be a study to do. Use the resources that I list and go from there. Search up topics here on YouTube. And this gets into trusting sources, because you definitely got to have the right sources, because you've got plenty of sources. This would be the example of one who's very critical of the King James and who will lead you astray if you don't know how to recognize the difference between truth and error. He is definitely critical of the Textus Receptus, and he seems to all too often ignore that there is a connection, an equality between Textus Receptus and the Byzantine text. Got a number of issues with him, of course, but he is, to be fair, trying to be reasonable from his point of view. And that's enough about him. Point is, there's going to be arguments from both sides, so you're definitely going to have to learn some discernment and figure out, how do you identify objective truth. If you start with the assumption, and I can tell you it's a safe assumption, but you shouldn't trust me, I'm nobody. You've got to verify it for yourself. If you start with the assumption that God did preserve his word, or you could say, what if God did preserve his word? It makes sense. He wants us to have it. If I start with that assumption and search, that's a good way to do it. Of course, some would say, oh, that's not right. That's having a bias. Well, you can't help do anything without bias if you think about it. Bias isn't necessarily a problem if you recognize that it's there, or if you're using it on purpose. If your purpose is to find out what is the truth, did God preserve his words? And if so, where did he in my language? Well, as I'm trying to spell out here, it's pretty obvious. In the English language, the best English Bible we have is the King James. There isn't anything better. And speaking of that point, let's move on to speaking about the other text here. So let's get some terms explained for the Alexandrian text type. It's called Alexandrian because of where it comes from in Alexandria, Egypt. Okay. And I'll show you a map here in a minute. It's also called minority text because at most there's only 50 of these things total, just 50. There's many, many thousands of the received texts, but there's just 50 at most of these. It could also be called an Egyptian text because of where it's found. And then just like with the received text, there's specific ones, specific text, the most famous ones, and I believe Sinaiticus is the oldest complete copy of the Bible. It's corrupt, but I believe it is the oldest complete copy to this day still. Sinaiticus is given that name. It's also called Codex Aleph. That's just for organizational purposes among literary scholars. But Sinaiticus is given that name because of where it was found, Mount Sinai. Again, I'll show you a map here in a little bit. And it was found, actually, I might as well put up that guy's picture. It was found by this guy who worked for the Catholic Church, and he had a passion for ancient texts and working with ancient texts and other ancient documents. So when he went to St. Catherine's Monastery in Egypt, and here's a map, there we go. Up there, circled in blue, is Alexandria, where the texts originated, hence the name. And then the line and the arrow points down to where the traditional Mount Sinai. It's not the real Mount Sinai. The real Mount Sinai is across that bay there in Midian, in North Saudi Arabia. That's a whole nother subject. But the traditional Mount Sinai, there's a monastery built there named in honor of Constantine the Great's mother. And you might have noticed this guy here had the name of Constantine as well. Just an interesting coincidence. But when I say Constantine the Great, I'm talking about the Emperor of Rome. His mother sought after a lot of holy sites in biblical history, and this was one of them. Anyways, so a monastery was built up there, and in this monastery were found the remains, these fragments. And there's a lot of fragments that have been found over the years. However, again, at best, there's 50. There's just 50 of these things total. And as you can see by these pictures, these are pictures of the papyrus. They're in very bad shape. Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, and there's one other, it's called Alexandrinus or whatever. Those are the best preserved, but Sinaiticus and Vaticanus are the oldest two. The Vaticanus was found in the library at Rome in the Vatican Library. But these here, they can all be, they're all the basis. So the Alexandrian text types, also called minority or Egyptian, and these are some specific examples, they're all the basis for what comes here. The text that is created by Doctors Westcott and Hort. And that's spelled out in a number of the sources that I'll be listing below. But Doctors Westcott and Hort are famous for creating the critical or eclectic, and of course with their name, Westcott and Hort text. It's an English text of the New Testament created from these Alexandrian texts. And these texts are corrupt. If you took all texts, including all of the received texts, so let's go back to this. If you take all of these texts, all of these, there's many, many thousands. We'll go into some of the numbers here in a bit. And then you got these 50. That's why they're minority. You put them all together. These agree with each other. We're talking like 98% of the time. And the difference is, where there are disagreement, it's like typist errors, spelling errors. It's very much nothing serious. Whereas these have some very serious changes. Let's see. I have the number, some of the numbers here. All right. Westcott and Hort refused to accept the Textus Receptus Greek. Though there was some scattered opposition to the received text in years before, the considered effort against the received text came in 1881. This is when Doctors Westcott and Hort were doing their work. In 1881, these two theologians from the Anglican Church, I think they were both professors at Cambridge, if I remember correctly, they published a Greek text that rejected Textus Receptus, the received text, and it differed in 5,604 places. So that's a pretty big change, and thanks to some really good work by some, honestly, Bible expert right here. Pierre Lippelinger has, and this is only 2, she's got like 8 of these things. She is a Bible nerd, especially when it comes to King James. She really goes in depth. It's insanely awesome. And her work is very good. There are critics who will go in and say, oh, she made mistakes. But as far as I can tell, there's like 7 mistakes out of this, what is this, 690-page book. That's pretty good for one single human author. Anyways, and the mistakes are very spurious, because she'll specify in her charts, like, hey, the King James says this, the New Version say that. And some of the times she will simply list, she'll list like a Bible version just by a simple code here. This one, it's NASB. Sometimes you'll have this phrase right here, NASB, NIV et al. And so the mistakes that she makes is just some will say, that thing she pointed out was corrected in this edition or whatever. It's being silly. Her work stands. She's done a very good job. And we're going to talk more about this later because there's something important there. But the point is, we're going over these manuscripts here. I need to talk about some of these too. Nestle and Allen, that's just an updated English version of the critical text. So they took Westcott and Hort's text, or the eclectic, or the critical, whatever you want to call it. They took that, and Nestle and Allen created a text that is widely used. And so it's kind of like a second edition of the critical text, but it's widely used. The Septuagint, I have that listed here. That's actually a very old one. It is a Greek copy of the Old Testament. Yeah, this goes all the way to Malachi. So this is Septuagint. It's a Greek copy of the Old Testament. And a lot of scholars like this one. For some reason, they say that Jesus and his disciples would have used this one. I have doubts. And I'll show you at least one reason why. When you do a study, and I've got it all marked up here, you study on just the genealogies. This is only one, because there's 2 genealogies in Genesis. This is the chapter 11 genealogy. There's also one, chapter 6? Anyways, point is, there's errors. And when you compare it to the King James, you find out, did a little chart here, you find I have it all marked in orange. There's several hundred years that are added in, and there's actually a whole other person. For some reason, the Septuagint says that Arphaxad had the son Canaan. King James says that he had the son Salah. Canaan belongs to a different genealogy, so this might be a typo. There's also a difference in the year. The Septuagint says that after Arphaxad had Salah as a son, he lived 400 years. The King James says he lived 403 years. So there's a difference there. And like I said, there's several others. So Septuagint has issues. It ain't perfect. And there is a bit of a connection, possibly with the Vaticanus manuscript. So if the Greek scholars who were putting together the Septuagint were doing it at the same time as Vaticanus, then that would be why. But others say, no, this is much older. This goes back to like 200 BC. Well, either way, it doesn't line up 100% with the Masoretic text. And the Masoretic text is equivalent to the received text for the Old Testament. These names here, by the way, this is all New Testament. Masoretic is the term for the Old Testament, the good Old Testament text. The one that these guys would use would be the abridged Masoretic or the Leningrad or... Oh, I have it right there. Yeah. Right here in the bottom corner. So, Latin Vulgate. And technically, the Latin Vulgate could fall within the received text. It's just there are spelling errors in the original one, and that's the ones that the Catholic used. But on this list, the Latin Vulgate's probably like the best one. Septuagint might be second best because the Leningrad has more errors, and then Kittel's Biblica Hebraica kind of doubles down on those errors. And I noticed, this is the Catholic Bible, this is the Douay-Rheims here. The Douay-Rheims are just the names of the colleges. Rheims is the college that did the Old Testament. I'm sorry, I'm doing it backwards. Douay, the English college that translated the Catholic Bible for the Old Testament, and then the Rheims College did the New Testament. But I did do a compare and study of a couple things in the Catholic Bible. And the Catholic Bible only has one single error, which could very well be a typo when you compare it with the King James when it comes to Genesis chapter 11. And this is just an example. If you were to go through these Bibles, and that's one of the reasons I brought up this book, people have done this before. There is another one. I will put it in the notes for this video, of course, but Look What's Missing by Daniel W. Daniels. That's another book where you have a scholar who has gone in depth and laid out the differences. But this is just one that I've noticed I'm pointing out just as an example. So you have something, a little food for thought. So yeah, verse 13, Douay-Rheims, Book of Genesis, chapter 11, verse 13. And Ariphax had lived after he begat Salah 303 years. So the Douay-Rheims says 303, the King James says 403. One number difference. Now that is, 100 years as far as the actual literacy, but point is, Catholics did better than the Septuagint as far as translating. But it's not perfect. It would, and that's why I have it on this side, Douay-Rheims, because the Catholics have a connection with Vaticanus Sinaiticus. Remember, Vaticanus is named because that text was at the Vatican in Rome, and this would be the reason why. This is the Archcove volume. It is a book that has a number of letters. And of course, like everything else, I will list this in the notes below. But here, you can see it right there, the chapter heading, Constantine's letter in regard to having 50 copies of the scripture written and bound. There's an introduction, and then his letter is recorded right there. So Constantine, Emperor of Rome, is the reason why there are 50 manuscripts. He ordered them. And he ordered them from Eusebius, who was a priest after the order of Origen. Origen was a Gnostic. So presumably, and the evidence we have in existence seems to back this up, Eusebius was also a Gnostic. And we have warnings against the Gnostics in the Bible. So that would explain why there's corruption in these texts. And that's why, as we saw in, did I put it over here? Where did I put the book? In the other book, where's my books? Too many books. In this one, that's why we have 5,000 plus changes, because these guys, when they were first creating these texts, they felt differently. They felt differently about, and he does a very good job of showing you what it is, the deity of Christ. There's a lot of changes. They make some specific changes. My pastor pointed out a really good one in a recent Sunday night message, because he's going over the King James issue. Lucifer, changing him, giving him the title of the morning star when Jesus is supposed to be the morning star. So stuff like this, very specific changes that are made, and that would also be one of the errors in the Catholic Bible, making that change. Okay. So all of this would be the historical trail leading up to the NIV, and it would be the first one. was it 1881 or was it 1890s? It's the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century when this new Bible comes out. So, we're now in this narrative, and all these things I'm saying, the subject of this video, we're now here into the modern times. And I just have a few here. These are probably the most famous ones. A lot of these new Bibles, obviously we're talking about the English language here still, whereas there's just this one. And there is one exception. I'll go ahead and put that up here. There is this one exception, and I have it here. But ultimately, it's just the King James. That's all it is. It has been updated, but nowhere near the way this one was. See this one here? They utilized this text that we were just talking about, the critical text, to make changes. The 21st century edition does not. All that it does, and it's explained right here in the front covers, besides, the whole reason I even know this exists is because of watching Dr. Dell Johnson's documentary that was put together about textual translation and textual criticism. It was hosted by Pensacola Christian College, I want to say in 1994. Unfortunately, they never produced new copies of it. There was just a few copies that were made. My pastor up in Dover got a VHS copy of the video. Hopefully by now he's got it transferred over to DVD. He's wanted to anyways. But unfortunately, yeah, that seminar was never reproduced. And it's a bit disappointing because Dr. Dell Johnson and a couple of the other experts there did an amazing job of not only defending the King James and going over a lot of the stuff I've gone over in this video, but in much more detail and in much better, eloquent, educated words. They went into depth. And they took their time going over Masoretic texts, received texts, all of that. But yeah, they said that this would be the only modern Bible that they'd recommend because all that it does is do a little bit of updating of the words. And again, they spell out what they did here in the beginning. It doesn't change these and thous because they explain how those are necessary, those are important, and they're easily understood. It makes changes to words that are hard to be understood. A few examples here. The word gins has been replaced by traps, betray, establish by establish, stuff like that. It's very, very reasonable stuff, very reasonable words. Obviously, something like this is probably not going to become all that famous because this is good enough. And objectively speaking, your regular Old King James everybody's familiar with it. In Christianity, even among the progressive crowd, they know about the King James. They might not like it. They might not study it because they want to have their new versions here. And it's unfortunate because it all stems from ignorance. Ignorance of this two-text issue, that these new ones all come from a bad text, a corrupt text, that at the beginning has the problem of having at least 5,000 differences from the received text, the one that the church has always used. Now let's go in, and I intended to have a picture. Shoot. There was a nice chart I wanted to have ready, and I forgot to set that up. Oh well. I guess you just have to take notes and picture it in your head. If you could picture the New Testament as a top line, when it was originally published, all the copies of it, and then what we have today, the next best historically documented item. What number should I choose? Okay, forgive me. There's a lot of information to go over here. I got to choose what to go over and what not to, because if I go too far, rabbit trail, bit too heavy, because this is supposed to be a summary overview. Okay, Greek language alone, I want to say there's 5,200. Do I have the numbers here? I might have the numbers here. Let's see. I thought I had the page open to the numbers. Forgive me. I could go, you can, and this is crazy because Wikipedia is generally not trustworthy, but I guess with stuff like this, it's such well-established knowledge that even Wikipedia has to agree that, yeah, these things exist. If you were to look up received text, Byzantine text, majority text on Wikipedia, you can get a listing of many thousands of documents that are all a part of this received text line. I thought I had a listing here. Oh, okay. These numbers are this is some of the more specific differences between the Alexandrian and the received. That's why I had this page open. So that's not what I want at this time. I want to say it's also 5,000 manuscripts in the Greek language. I know the Old Testament, the Masoretic, they've got over 14,000 manuscripts, ancient manuscripts. And we're talking, these go all the way back into BC with the Masoretic texts. And they come forward, as I said before, all the way up to around the 1600s, because by the 1500s, you start having books being printed. So there's no more manuscripts, no more scribes copying. So, but up until that period, there was still some. So you're going to have from 4 to 200 BC, that time frame. I'm pretty sure we have manuscripts, things written that exist from back then. They're still around today. And all the way up through all the centuries. And certain centuries, 4th century is a big one. I think 12th century is a big one. There's a lot there. I do apologize for not having these numbers ready. I spent all day trying to get ready for this video, but there's so much stuff that, of course, I was bound to miss something, and this would be something I should have had ready, is some of the numbers ready for you. I just hate that I don't have the numbers ready. Come on, I thought I had it ready here. Okay, there's that list, and there's that list. But these are not the lists that I need. And, oh! Is that it? No. That's not it. That's not it. Just a couple more seconds. Ooh, maybe this will see. Oh, no, those are years. Tisk! All right, you'll just have to look up the numbers for yourself, but it is in the thousands. I'm sorry about that. It's over 5,000 or 6,000 for Greek, Koine Greek manuscripts of the New Testament. I'm pretty sure it's over 6,000 Koine Greek, and then you've got Coptic texts. I want to say there's several hundred of those. You got Byzantine texts. There's several thousands of those. You got the Textus Receptus. There's like 2,300 of those, so that's Latin. Syriac, you have some in German, you have some early Italian, you have some early French, Spanish. So there's a lot of manuscripts out there, and again, these all belong to the received text line. They're all very similar. And the fascinating thing about these is that even though they're written by men, scribes, sometimes groups, thousands of years apart, nowadays we can take both of them. In fact, I have my own copy of the Greek received text right here. I can't read much of it because I only took one college course of Greek, but I have it to access, and I have used it a few times, and it's pretty neat to be able to see. If I took this, my copy of received text, and I went to one of these museums, one of these universities, especially the ones in Europe where they have the really old manuscripts, I could open it and I could compare with the text laying there. I've only got to do, and it wasn't with this because it was Old Testament, but I've only got to see one of the very old text, and this was one of the Qumran texts, Dead Sea Scrolls. So that was really neat to see. You could see the original Hebrew. But yeah, if you were to take this, which is this one was printed, I want to say 94, by the Trinitarian Bible Society. 76. This is a 1976 book, actually. So this is a copy of a copy of a copy, but this is received text. And if I were to take and look at a text that was written back in the 4th century, again, one of these received texts, lay them side by side and look at them, they would be nearly identical. And this is what happens. This is what has happened. When they look at 16th century texts, compare it to 12th or 10th or 5th century texts, all of these, Byzantine, received. We're not talking about these 50 here. There. We're not talking about those. We're talking about all these. No matter when they're written. They're 98%. Even Wikipedia admits it. 98%. Agree. They agree 98%. Forgive me. They agree 98%. This is unheard of in academics. I was going to list it earlier, and I stopped myself. The second most documented historical writing on the planet is the Iliad and the Odyssey by Homer. If you know anything about Greek history, you might have heard of that. It's a fictional story, kind of poetic mythology. It's telling about Ulysses and his traveling the great seas with this group of men on the ship, and they visit different islands, and all these crazy and fancy things happen, and they deal with the gods and giants and everything like that. The Iliad and the Odyssey. I think the Odyssey is the one. The Iliad is a story of the Battle of Troy, the Trojan War, King Agamemnon, Achilles, and the gods, all that. Anyways, so that's the second most documented historical writing on the planet. That has 600 manuscripts. That's amazing, but 600 is nothing compared to the thousands and thousands that the received text has of the New Testament. This is why scholars, even James White, even him, who would be a critic of the King James, or Bart Ehrman, Dr. Bart Ehrman, who is not even a Christian. Last I looked, I think he's agnostic, but he is a textual critic or a textual translation history expert. This is his expert field, and he'll tell you the New Testament is the most documented book on the planet. It's the most authentic record of ancient history. He will admit Jesus Christ is a real historical figure, documented better than almost anybody because of these thousands of texts. This is big. This is one of the set of details that a lot of modern pastors and people who use these new versions don't seem to have any idea about. All that they hear is, oh, the Alexandrian, they have the oldest text ever of the New Testament, Sinaiticus Vaticanus. So yeah, I want to use that because it's in my language and it's the oldest text. And that catches everybody. They get stuck with that. And then they get scholars like this that convince them, oh, you don't need to use the King James. It's really not that much better. But this is not an objective assessment of all of the facts. This is not an objective assessment of the fact that this exists. And it's got a well-documented trail of history going all the way back through the centuries. Again, even Wikipedia, which is not a trustworthy source. You look up certain Bible bits of history on there, and they've got it wrong. They don't understand the difference between Protestants and Baptists and Catholics. But anyways, even Wikipedia admits there are many thousands of documents, received Byzantine text type, Textus Receptus, that exist, and this is what the King James is based on. So this is why this one is the best. And all of these new ones, again, I'm holding this one up because this is my parallel one. It's got the 4 in there. All these new ones are based on a corrupt text. And as far as I know, there's only the one exception, as I mentioned here, 21st century edition, but it's basically just a slightly updated King James version. So it's still a King James, because King James is the best. I think I've gone over most of the material I wanted to go over. Let's see. Oh yeah, I should address this. There is a big push out there to try and say, and the pastor I listened to the other night, that's what he said. He brought up, well, you can't, we know God didn't preserve the words because there's contradictions. And I couldn't believe an evangelical pastor was saying that. But that's what he's grown up in. When you've grown up in a culture that uses his new versions, has no idea about the textual history, and has guys like this that confirm, oh, no, yeah, you don't need the King James. No wonder they talk like that. But there's no such thing as an actual contradiction in the Bible. There's only seeming contradictions. Or at least, I've never seen one. I hear them all the time say, and I go and watch the video, and they never give an actual contradiction. They bring up stupid stuff like Leviticus says that a grasshopper goes on 4 legs or whatever. Like, see, that's wrong. And grasshoppers got 6 legs. But it's like, did you ever observe? They don't. You need to talk to the insectologist or the entomologist, the guys that study these things. The 2 back legs are different. They don't always actually. When I've seen them walk, and that's just something I've observed, grasshoppers will walk on the 4 legs. They don't use the back 2 except to jump, usually, or if they're making a big cross, they'll use it occasionally. But point is, it's more than likely the Bible is simply describing a physical scientific phenomenon of the grasshopper walks on 4 legs. He doesn't use all 6 to walk. So there's not a contradiction. That's kind of a silly one. There's another one with the measurements given between the book of Kings, the book of Chronicles, where they're talking about the measurements of the brazen altar in Solomon's temple. And they say, oh, there's a contradiction because the numbers are different. But there is no contradiction. I think the book of Kings, one of them is giving the outside circumference. And it's a bowl made of brass. The other one's giving the inside circumference. Of course, they're going to be different. And it's just a slightly different because of the thickness of the brass. So, again, no real contradictions. I was holding this book here, even though his style is a bit crass and crude. He does a good job of laying out that there are not errors in the King James. There are not errors in your Bible. God did preserve it. He did a very good job of it. I think that's everything I wanted to go over. I just need to get all this stuff documented on this video, which of course, as you're watching this, you've already got it there to look at. So I believe that is it. One thing I just wanted to leave you with is, I hit the wrong button again. This is a good documentary that, at least at the time of me putting out my video, this is, well, I could put it the wrong way. This is free. Very good, just put out by Dr. Jordan Peterson, and the title is listed right here, The Bible, the Most Influential Book in History. It's a YouTube video. In the future, if you're watching this in the future, you'd have to go sign up with Daily Wire if you don't already have an account to watch it, but it's excellent. It's just under an hour long, and he does an overview of the history of the Bible, focusing on the idea that it's the most influential book. It caused the Reformation. Once people started getting the Word of God in their hands and studying it, it inspired them to do things. And those of us who know real history know that Christopher Columbus was inspired by his reading of the Bible to do what he did and cross the sea a different way, and thereby discovering America on accident. Even though it was already discovered before, just the Western world hadn't recognized it. Columbus is the one responsible for having the Western world realize, oh, we can get to it. It's right there. In nowadays culture, that might not be the best example, just because there's so much negativity around him. But I'd highly encourage you to just do your research, do your study. If you can get, Columbus is a good example here, if you can read what he actually wrote, read what is written about him by people who lived at the same time. His letters exist. And go read and study historians that talk about their objective with the facts. They don't ignore stuff. They don't jump to conclusions. They don't just tell you things. They tell you where they got their source material, or they show you, Columbus's letters. Forgive me, stuff like this. Going to the source, first-hand witnesses. This is some of the important things that prove these things true. And that brings me back. I wanted to bring it up, and I kind of forgot. The Gospels are one of the big ones, and when it comes to the argument of contradictions in the Bible, but there are no contradictions in the Bible. The Gospel accounts are written by 4 different authors. Each one's an eyewitness, and they simply notice different things. There's a different point of view for each of them. That's all. It's really not that hard to understand. If you were to study, for example, if you're just, and I've done it myself. I have it on the computer here, an Excel worksheet where I did a gospel study because I wanted to compare scripture and see what is the historical timeline of what Jesus did. And I discovered while doing that, because I'd never heard of it before, that Jesus cleansed the temple at least 3 different times. He did it once, pretty early on in his ministry, and that's the one where he prepared the small whip, cat o' nine tails, and then it's recorded that he did it twice, right there leading up to his Passion Week at the end. I never realized that. I never realized Jesus went and flipped tables and kicked the money changers out of the temple 3 different times. I thought he just did it once. But a synoptic study of the gospel, comparing them, putting them together, that's how you find out. So if people are calling some of that contradictions because they're reading these different accounts in the gospel thinking, oh, well, he did this in this one, but he didn't do it here. No. You're probably mistaking. Those are different events. That's why there's some differences. Other times, it's just as simple as this person, talked about this, what he saw and what he heard. This person talked about this and what he saw. There is no contradiction. These things both happen. You just got different perspectives. So again, if you study the Word of God and examine these claimed contradictions, you can find out there is no real contradictions. They're just seeming contradictions. That word has the idea it seems like a contradiction, but it's not. And as I've already pointed out, the record of history, if you look at it objectively when it comes to the Bibles, it's pretty obvious that God did preserve his word. How the Bible has survived, what it's been through, entire nations, emperors, popes trying to eradicate it, trying to destroy it. And of course, people dying and giving their lives to protect it and to copy it and translate it into their languages. It was pretty crazy. And I mentioned it briefly. William Tyndale, and then there was also, and a couple others early on. John Wycliffe would be one. When they made their translations of the Bible, it was illegal for some reason. But again, this was just the state of the world back then, and in many ways indicative of the tyranny of the Roman Catholic institution that ruled the world for several hundred years. I guess that's enough. Let's see. What do we have time? Just over an hour? Yeah, might as well. That should be good. Thanks for putting up with my ramblings. Hopefully this has been helpful. Obviously, feel free to ask any questions if you have them, and definitely take a look at the sources. At the very bottom of my list of sources, I will be posting my website link, specifically the page on the Bible. So do go there because I will have a lot more resources on proving the veracity of the Bible on that webpage. But otherwise, yeah, all the books that I reference here, I will link. And there's some I didn't reference, but I'll be putting them there because they pertain to this topic. But yeah, thanks again for listening. And I guess that's it.